Hold on to your butt.
Da-da-da. You were saying?
Welcome to episode 145 of the Civil War Breakfast Club podcast. Tonight, as always, I am joined by the most awesome Civil War nerd I know, Darren. And that's the only way I know how to introduce him. I'm his co-host, Mary. And tonight we are talking about an episode that has probably a lot of intrigue. It's something that if you've watched the movie Gettysburg, you will be familiar with the person that we are going to talk about, even though he's not in it very much. But before we get to that, Darren, how are you doing?
Hi, Mary. How are you? Great intro as always. That was very exciting. It only took 5 takes, but yeah, that's when you come up with. So fantastic. So how are you doing tonight?
I'm good. How are you? I'm looking forward to recording.
Yeah, I could obviously tell you're so excited. Yeah, so
what are you drinking?
oh my God, dang! I thought you were never going to ask.
Well, you forgot in last episode.
Oh, it's okay. I'm drinking Argyle Sweater from Appalachian Beer Company, which is a beer brewery right around the corner here in Gettysburg, and I'm drinking it out of my Knights Templar mug because that is likewise a subject of mystery and intrigue, kind of our episode tonight a little bit, Mary. And so I will return the favor now and ask you, what are you drinking?
I'm drinking Hoppy Trails IPA, also from Appalachian Brewing, which is just down the street from us. And I am drinking it out of my Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain mug, which he's not going to be in our episode tonight, but he is in the movie Gettysburg, which the person we're going to be talking about was also a character in the movie Gettysburg. So really looking forward to recording this with you tonight. And you were the one that kind of stumbled upon this person because you were just researching a little bit more about him one day.
Sort of. So even tonight, to your point, we're going to be going back into that shadowy world of Civil War espionage, Mary, to talk about a man who, although most Civil War buffs know, is one whose truth was really discovered relatively recently. You know, because of his appearance in Michael Shara's Killer Angels in the 1993 movie Gettysburg, Mary. Confederate General James Longstreet Scout Harrison is a household name for the Gettysburg people, but whose real-life story is much more fascinating. And, you know, though the movie, portrays Harrison as kind of a fun-loving, goofy actor from Mississippi with a fondness for good Southern tobacco, right? The real Harrison's reality is much different than the pop culture. And, you know, one of the best things about history is, unlike math or science, it can change, and a historian's opinion is only as good as a new piece of evidence, and that's the case with Harrison, who finally wasn't really identified, believe it or not, Mary, until the 1980s.
Which would be well after Michael Shara had published The Killer Angels.
And right after when you were getting jammed in lockers in school, right around the same time this is all getting taken care of.
God.
You know, but before we get into the real Harrison, though, I think it's important to talk about how we got here and how a small group of amateur historians really pick through the morsels of history to finally learn that true identity of this enigmatic Harrison. And you know, the first time Harrison is really mentioned publicly was in April of 1887, when General James Longstreet mentioned him in an article in a Century magazine. And in that article, Longstreet describes first meeting him and how the relationship led to his information that may or may not have saved the Army of Northern Virginia from annihilation during the Gettysburg campaign, right? Longstreet's going to write, "One night in the spring of 1863, I'm sitting in my tent opposite Suffolk, Virginia." This is a quote, by the way. "When there came in a slender, wiry fellow, about 5'8", with hazel eyes, dark hair, and a brown beard." He goes on, "He wore a citizen's suit of dark material and was a man of great activity. He handed me a note from Mr. Seddon," which is Confederate Secretary War James Seddon, Mary. "This was my first meeting with the Scout Harrison, who in his unpretending citizen's dress passed unmolested from right to left through the Federal Army, visiting Washington City, and drank with several Federal officers." Just like you, right? But that's the thing about him, though, is in 1896, Longstreet in his memoirs is going to again mention him, this time adding the first image of him, an older photo of him, and again praising him as an active, intelligent, enterprising scout who I retained in my service. And, you know, the thing about it is that I guess the primary reason, and this is kind of logical, I suppose, why Harrison's identity was never known, it was that Longstreet never mentioned his first name. Mm-hmm. He never did. And I think the reality is either he didn't know it, which is certainly possible, or more likely, He wanted to protect his identity because even after the war, spies were discriminated against.
Yep.
They were retaliated against by civilians. It hurt their future job prospects. So it made sense. Mm-hmm. Even obviously during the war, if a spy was caught, unfortunately, he'd have to be hanged, right? So hiding his or her identity became second nature even after the war ended. So for over a century after the Civil War ended, the identity of Harrison was a mystery. And though mentioned post-war twice by Longstreet, right, in that Century magazine article, and again in his memoirs 10 years later, no one knew who he really was. Or more importantly, no one knew what ever happened to him. I mean, just think about it. You disappeared for years. It seemed that Harrison was destined to become lost to history like so many other people that we study.
Well, I was going to say, like, how many people have we studied that are lost to history, like men and women, like somebody like Fanny Granberry, who was married to Hiram Granberry. She was lost to history for a lot of years. And many of them are. And Harrison definitely is one of these guys that, there's a lot of intrigue around him. The thing that I think about when I think of Harrison is that one line from General Lee in the movie Gettysburg: "We move on the word of an actor." Mm-hmm. Like that's the one thing that I associate with Harrison, is him being this actor who kind of comes into the camp. He's not, when he's found by the guy that looks like Santa Claus, the guy's like who
the rebel gnome, the lawn gnome,
the lawn gnome.
Howdy, friend.
Howdy, friend. Points a gun at him. And then, of course, the reference to, like, the good Virginia tobacco. Like, that's how I see Harrison.
Well, here's the reason why that gets that way, is because they're putting pieces together. In April of 1970, an article is going to come out in Civil War Times magazine. It'll be written by a historian and Civil War spy expert named John Bakeless. He's going to claim that he found out the identity of the mysterious Harrison, and in this article, he explained his findings. According to Bakeless, in his research, Longstreet scout was none other than the famous Richmond, Virginia actor James Harrison, who was born in 1834 and died in 1913. So it seemed anyway that Harrison's identity had finally been discovered and the mystery was put to rest and all the rest. This theory was accepted, for years. And why in 1974, Michael Schauer described Harrison as an actor. And why the Harrison the actor myth that you just talked about still lives on today, right? If you happen to watch the director's cut of Gods and Generals by Jeff Schauer, there's a scene where the actor, spy Harrison is in a scene with another well-known actor, John Wilkes Booth, which obviously never happened. But in the Schauer book, Killer Angels, what it did is, because of the book, it led others to kind of speculate more on who this Harrison character was, right? Bakeless' theory wasn't without inconsistencies, so it led people to kind of keep searching, right? The big flaw we'll talk about in Bakeless' study is James Harrison, the actor. He wrote about this in the July 1980 issue of Virginia magazine. This is kind of how the whole thing kind of came about. Mm-hmm. And this is the flaw someone brought out in this magazine, The article documented that at the same time that Harrison the spy was imprisoned in North Carolina, and we'll talk about that James Harrison, the actor, was literally on stage in Richmond. So there's no way it could be the same person.
Yeah.
There's no way. Enter an amateur historian named James O. Hall. And we've talked about him off and on for different things. He specializes in debunking Lincoln assassination conspiracies.
Was he the one that debunked the Eisenschimel?
Yes. That's him, right? He's also the one who the Museum and Research Center at the Surratt House in Clinton, Maryland is named for. So we talked about that. Hall became fascinated by the Harrison story. And after looking at that photo of the actor James Harrison, as well as the one that Longstreet included in his memoirs, remember I mentioned he wrote in his memoirs, and you can look up his memoirs and see the picture, Hall became convinced that they were not the same guy, and he began to do his own research into Harrison's identity. And Mary, sometimes you get lucky, right?
Yep.
And in history. And this is when James O. Hall found a little luck of the Irish, as they say, in his search for the real Harrison. One of Hall's friends was another amateur historian named David Gaddy. David Gaddy wasn't just an average historian, an amateur historian, He just happened to be a former government intelligence officer who specializes in what? espionage, and code ciphers. Matter of fact, in 1989, Gaddy became the first chief of the National Security Agency's Center of Cryptological History in Annapolis Junction, Maryland. So this is kind of a legit guy. Gaddy would later team up with James O'Hall and fellow intelligence officer William Tidwell to write a book called Come Retribution, which is about the Confederate Secret Service and rebel espionage and all that. So he was really into it. Well, one day Hall gets a call from Gaddy, who told him about a conversation he had with a woman from Falls Church, Virginia, named Marion Ralph. Mrs. Ralph told Gaddy that her grandfather had been a Confederate spy during the war and was a personal scout of James Longstreet. She told Gaddy her grandfather's name was Henry Thomas Harrison. She then showed Gaddy a couple of letters that the family had in their collection, as well as 2 photographs of him, a wedding photo, and also that well-known photo most people see when they Google Harrison today, the one he's wearing the 2nd lieutenant uniform. So, understanding that her grandfather was a spy, Mrs. Ralph pointed out to Gaddy in that the photograph of this uniform, that in the photo he's holding in his hands a piece of paper, and in it he's pointing to a list of numbers written on it, and asked him if he thought that was some kind of code, some kind of cipher, because it just looked strange. Well, Gaddy, like I said, just happened to be one of the world's most renowned experts on Confederate codes and ciphers. He recognized it as a Confederate cipher used in Mississippi during the war. So after researching the code, he spent some time with it. He discovered that the code actually read, "I love you," and the photograph was meant for his wife, Laura, in Virginia. So if you Google Harrison the Spy, you'll see the picture I'm talking about.
It is such a cool picture.
And everyone's seen this picture, but no one's ever noticed what's in his hand, which is kind of cool, right? One of the letters that Mrs. Ralph showed Gaddy was dated 1900, and it read, quote, "Just came over here this morning from Firestone, where I found Colonel Fairfax well, and he was glad to see me again." Colonel Fairfax was John W. Fairfax, a former Longstreet's, one of his staff during the war. Gaddy then told Hall about all he heard, what he learned, about what he discovered about Harrison. And he was happier than you were when you found that last Labatt's Blue in the back of the fridge. Because this was when I said this is how you get lucky. This is what happened. So what does Hall do? He's going to take the name Henry Thomas Harrison into the National Archives in Washington, and he's going to find Harrison's pay vouchers as well as other documents that did finally prove once and for all that Henry T. Harrison was the true identity of Longstreet's mysterious spy. So again, we're talking in the 1980s here.
Yeah.
This is how long this was.
And again, this is after The Killer Angels has been published. Movie Gettysburg obviously has not been made yet. It's not going to be made till 1993.
Right.
But, Harrison is a real person, unlike, Buster Kilrain, who, sorry to disappoint y'all, Buster Kilrain's not real.
Rude of my St. Patty's Day. So what does Hall do is he's going to take his findings and he's going to write an article in the February 1986 edition of the Civil War Times, an article called Hunting the Spy Harrison. I can remember this is less than 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Right? So James O'Hall, he'd finally solved a centuries-old mystery and became driven to learn more about Harrison as much as he possibly could. Now he was going down this rabbit hole. So what does he do? He's going to drive to Falls Church, Virginia, to meet with Mrs. Ralph, we just talked about, who told him that most of the stories she knew about Harrison were passed down to her from her mother, Irene, who was Harrison's daughter.
Yeah.
Now, Mrs. Ralph told him that in 1863, her grandfather met his future wife, a woman named Laura Broders, while she lived on a large plantation in Fairfax County, Virginia, called Oak Grove. She said Harrison had used Oak Grove as his base of operations during his Confederate spy operation while he was spying in Washington in 1863. Mrs. Ralph then referred Hall to one of her nephews and Harrison's maternal grandson, a man named Bernie Becker, who was also an amateur historian, who was researching his covert but famous grandfather as well. So they sit down in Virginia, and they begin to sit down and compare notes, and they fill in the gaps. And then the story of Henry Harrison kind of comes into view, a story that was thought to be lost to history. But again, the thing about this, though, these stories like the ones we're talking about here, this is why we do history.
Yep.
You know, because these things that are just gone, and sometimes you just get lucky. And then when you do, it opens up the entire world in front of you.
Well, yeah, it's like when you're trying to find the answer to something and you go down like a rabbit hole looking for that answer. And I mean, sometimes it's tough to find it, but then sometimes you do. And that's the way this story about Harrison has come about. And the only other example I can think of is like in the last few years, there's been like, you know, more stuff come out about General Henry Warner Slocum here at Gettysburg, that for a long time his reputation here was not that good. Well, recent evidence has shown that it's actually better than what it is. And that's why, like, you know, you keep researching this because you never know what you're going to find.
And so now we have an idea who he was. Henry Harrison was born on April 23rd, 1832, near Nashville. He was the son of a riverboat captain with the same name. He went by Harry to avoid confusion with his father. In April of 1861, Harrison is going to join the Confederate Army in Sartasha, Mississippi. And he became a member of the Sartasha Rifles, which would join the 12th Mississippi Regiment. Now, here's what's cool about pop culture and history. If you're an astute fan of the movie Gettysburg, you will notice that when Tom Berenger, who plays Longstreet, what does he refer to as Harrison when he meets Lee?
The Mississippian?
The actor from Mississippi. So
yeah.
What does he do? They're merging what was known about Harrison in 1974 with Killer Angels, using Bakeless's info that he was an actor. And now what they're doing is they're adding the second bit of information after Hawley's from Mississippi. So they're merging the two. I don't know if it's an homage to both of them, but he becomes an actor from Mississippi, which is a perfect tie of both fields of thought about Harrison during this time, which I think is pretty cool.
And that's sometimes what happens with history is you don't have the evidence to prove one way or another, so you kind of start merging the stories of the people or the person in this case.
Yeah, and so Harrison is 12th Mississippi. They were sent to Manassas Junction, Virginia, but they got there just after the battle ended, the first battle of Bull Run, so he didn't see any action. But by the fall of 1861, the 12th Mississippi was in camp near Fairfax County, Virginia. Okay? It was here Harrison began his career as a scout, and when he would meet his future wife, Laura Broder, and her family at that Oak Grove plantation. Laura, like I said, was the woman Harrison sent the coded I love you message to in that photograph.
Yeah.
So November 5th, 1861, Harrison is going to write one of those letters that Mrs. Ralph showed to Gaddy and James Hall. Basically, it was just a letter saying how much he missed her and missed Laura, blah, blah, blah. But then he also mentioned that he was getting a medical discharge from the Army, which is kind of random. Now, it's very likely that this medical discharge was fake and was a cover for his scouting activities, because he needed something to show if he got caught by the Federals that he wasn't a spy.
Yeah.
And now that made sense, because if you're sick and you're too sick to fight, you can't go off and spy.
No.
And he went to spy. So jump ahead to January 6th of 1863. And at this point, Harrison was scouting U.S. Grant's army.
Was he scouting for James Seddon? Is that who he was?
Seddon was, we'll get to that.
Yeah.
Seddon basically was the one who sent him to Longstreet originally, but he hasn't quite got there yet. At this point, he's scouting for William Loring.
Oh, okay.
And he's watching Grant's movements throughout northern Mississippi. And he writes a letter explaining what Grant's doing. He signs it H.T. Harrison, C.S. Okay, so it kind of ties it again together. Yeah. But at this point, soon after that, this is when he gets sent east and assigned to James Longstreet in March of 1863. And again, Longstreet talks about this. He mentioned that, like we said earlier, in the Century Magazine article and his memoirs, where he meets him in Suffolk, Virginia. In his memoirs, this is Moxley Sorrell's memoirs now, recollection of a Confederate staff officer. He's going to write of this initial meeting in Suffolk and specifically noticed how unusual Harrison was. He writes, as a quote, "While Longstreet was holding this brief independent command, a scout was placed in his service by the War Department." Seddon. He was a man about 30 years old, calling himself a Mississippian, and was altogether a very extraordinary character. Now, it's probable that the actor Cooper Huckabee's portrayal of Harrison in the movie Gettysburg as a fun-loving, goofy character comes from this quote. Because it's the only thing that really explains him, his personality. And it says he's very strange, very extraordinary. And that's probably where he got it from.
Yeah, I was going to say, like, the character of Harrison in the movie Gettysburg is very, as you say, he's very fun-loving. He's very extroverted, very much how you would think an actor would be. And he's very friendly towards Longstreet. He's very friendly towards everybody he meets as well.
And so trusting Seddon's opinion of Harrison as a trustworthy scout, Longstreet is going to send him to Goldsboro, North Carolina initially to assist General Daniel Harvey Hill, D.H. Hill, who was planning his assault near New Bern on Fort Anderson. Now, here's the thing. It was during this time when Harrison was heading to North Carolina to go spy for Hill where he gets caught by the feds. He gets bagged, who charge him of being a Confederate spy. So what does Harrison do? He's going to deny that he's a spy, and he's going to pull out his papers saying what?
That he's
on a medical discharge.
Yep, discharge.
And he shows him his papers on medical discharge. He goes, yeah, I was a former soldier. I got sick and I got released. Now I'm a civilian. And a couple of takeaways with this. For one, again, it's clear that medical discharge was not true. And it was his get out of jail free card. There's no question that it was. Because again, if he's too sick, he can't be doing this. Now, if it was this evidence, and that this was in late March, April 1863, well, Harrison was a captive in North Carolina because he was in prison for a few weeks before they released him. This is the evidence that debunked John Bakesley's James Harrison as a spy story because, like I said, Harrison was on stage in Richmond during this 2 weeks while Harrison, the spy, was in jail. So someone figured that out, and that's why that whole thing got debunked. So Harrison does get released because he had no evidence to be held, and he goes back to Virginia. And he's going to meet with Longstreet, who gave him a new assignment, right? So what's going on at this time? The Army of Northern Virginia was in the early stages of their advance north that would become the Gettysburg Campaign.
Yep.
So Longstreet orders Harrison to go to Washington to scout for any info that they could use in the campaign. And this is the quote from the article that I found that Longstreet wrote in Century Magazine. This is in 1887. Before we left Fredericksburg for the campaign into Maryland and Pennsylvania, I called my scout Harrison and gave him all the gold he thought he would need, told him to go to Washington City and remain there until he was in possession of information which he knew would be of value to us, and directed that he should make his way back to me and my report. And in his memoirs in 1896, he kind of expands on it, Longstreet does. He writes, I sent a requisition to Richmond for gold coins for my scout Harrison, gave him what he thought he would need, and sent him off with secret orders, telling him I don't care to see him again until he could bring me information of importance. And this is kind of funny, because reading between the lines, he doesn't say this, but Harrison must have asked Longstreet, when I get the information, how do I find you?
Yeah.
Because in Longstreet's next quote in his memoirs, he writes, he was told that the headquarters of the First Corps was large enough for any intelligent man to find.
Oh my God.
So the way he writes it is just, you can kind of see him asking, well, how do I find you? You know? June 3rd, 1863, Harrison has $150 in gold is what he's given.
Wow.
He leaves for Washington, which is also the same day that the Gettysburg Campaign begins, June 3rd, 1863. What does he learn in Washington? That Joseph Hooker's Army of the Potomac was moving from Fredericksburg, Virginia, and he was moving to stop Robert E. Lee's move towards the north, right? Harris is wearing civilian clothes. He proceeds to Frederick, Maryland, and he's going to be around that growing Union Army who was advancing on that area. So everybody knows what happens next, right?
Yeah.
Stonewall Jackson is going to be killed. Lee now has 3 corps under Longstreet, Richard Ewell, and A.P. Hill, and due to the terrain in Maryland and Pennsylvania, and for a million other reasons, they were split up and they were vulnerable.
Yeah.
At one point, Lee's army was spread over a 55-mile wide arc around the town of Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Right?
Yep.
So Harrison, he leaves Frederick, in Maryland and proceeds to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania to find Longstreet's headquarters, famously to let Lee know that Federal Army was close, they were on the move, and that George Meade was now in charge of the Army of the Potomac.
So we're now at June 29th, right?
Well, June 28th. And here's what's funny about this. And you read this stuff long enough, you notice some things here and there. By most accounts, Harrison arrived in Chambersburg during the night of the 28th. So considering he would have traveled almost 60 miles from Frederick, Maryland to Chambersburg, Pennsylvania on a horse, he would have had to really begin his journey very, very early on the morning of the 28th, right? Mm-hmm. So what else happened in the morning of the 28th?
That's when Meade got...
3 o'clock in the morning.
Yep.
George Meade gets awoken in his tent and told that he's the big man.
Yep.
He's in the big chair, right? It's very hard to imagine that Harrison could have possibly learned this information
I was
so
going to
quickly.
say, like, how could he know that if he's not... Like, he's riding towards Longstreet at this point, so how could he get that information?
He certainly didn't read about it in the Yankee papers.
No.
You know? So it's possible, but the thing is, so it's very unlikely, and we'll talk about this in a few minutes, but it's unlikely that Lee learned about that from Harrison.
Yeah.
It's also possible Lee already knew the Federal Army was on the move before Harrison even got there. In a letter that Robert E. Lee wrote to General Richard Ewell, it was dated June 28th at 7:30 a.m. This is what Lee writes. I wrote you last night on the 27th, stating that General Hooker is reported to have crossed the Potomac and is advancing towards Middletown, the end of the column being at the point of Frederick County. I directed you in that letter, the one last night, to move your forces to this point. When you come to Heidlersburg, you can either move directly to Gettysburg or turn down to Cashtown. Now, if that letter is true, then Lee knew a full 24 hours before Harrison's arrival. But even that letter is debated because Walter Taylor allegedly wrote it and cleans it up after the war and changed some stuff. So we don't know what he did. So who knows, right?
Yeah, it's all very, like, mysterious, and that's why, like, it's so interesting that this... I mean, it's not surprising that his story stayed kind of buried for, like, over 100 years, right? That nobody knew much about him.
Just about 100, 110, 120, depending on when you want to look at it. But the one that is a fact, though, is Harrison did arrive at Longstreet's headquarters, and just like the movie, he was arrested by Confederate pickets. Hazardous, too, right?
Yeah.
Longstreet writes in his memoirs about this. A young man had been arrested by our outlying pickets under suspicious circumstances. He was looking for my headquarters, but his comfortable apparel and well-to-do appearance caused doubt in the minds of the guards of his being a genuine Confederate who could be trusted around my headquarters. So he was sent under file or men to be identified. He proved to be Harrison, my valued scout. Again, no word if the rebel guard gnome is the one who brought him in.
I was going to say, was it the lawn gnome that brought him in?
But he was arrested, and that is true. Harrison is going to first meet with Moxley Sorrell, who took him to see Longstreet. Mm-hmm. And Longstreet he then ordered one of his staff, Colonel John Fairfax, to take Harrison to see Lee at his headquarters in the Messersmith Woods near the Modern Day Pizza Hut on Lincoln Highway. There is no evidence, Mary, that Harrison used any of his remaining gold to purchase a stuffed crust and wings bundle for $20.
Was anybody killed or wounded at the Pizza Hut? Because that's the other trend with Pizza Huts.
Is. But the thing about it, though, in all seriousness, there's also no real evidence that Harrison ever met Lee personally either, and that his info of Federal Corps locations was likely passed on to Lee by Colonel Fairfax. If you remember, Mary, you've probably forgotten. Colonel Fairfax is the man Harrison met years later in the letter to his granddaughter that he showed to David Gaddy in the 1980s. So it was to him, it was to Fairfax. Lee had faith in Harrison's info primarily due to the fact that he was Longstreet's personal scout. That's really the only reason why. But it should be noted that when Longstreet described this meeting with Harrison in Chambersburg in his 1896 memoirs, he does not mention anything whatsoever about learning that Joseph Hooker had been replaced by George Meade.
Yep.
So there's no evidence that intel came along at any point. It just kind of showed up in there.
Yeah,
So
and
there
I
you
think
go.
that's one of those things that, like, wouldn't that be something if Harrison was the one to tell Longstreet? So I think that's one of those things that is kind of, it's part of kind of the Killer Angels, I think, and all that, but it's not part of the true history to it.
Well, the prevailing history is that Harrison's info surprised Lee because his army was truly spread out, and then when he heard of the intelligence that Harrison provided, that he ordered his army to concentrate at Gettysburg.
Yeah.
But that's debated in that letter we just read about. You know who else does it? Who debates it is Alan Gelzo.
Yeah.
And we talked about that with him.
Yeah.
He also doesn't think that's the way it went down either. But regardless, Mary, Harrison's info was correct, and whether it surprised Lee or not, the info arguably saved Lee's army from annihilation at Gettysburg. There's no question.
Yeah.
But that's where the story ends with Harrison for the most part. But it does not, though. Harrison's story does not end at Gettysburg. It continues. And this is why I think it's actually more fascinating. This is post-Gettysburg history.
Yes.
September of 1863, Harrison will take a leave and visit Richmond. And he messaged Moxley Sorrell to let him know that he should come to town because he'll be performing in a play. You know the story?
Yeah. Is this where he is like, Sorrell thinks he's intoxicated on stage?
Right. So Sorrell, he didn't know, what Sorrell didn't know, that Harrison had bet somebody $50 that he could talk his way into getting a small part in this play. Now, he's an actor.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a spy. And spies, by their nature, have to be pretty good actors. Look no further than Pauline Casting Couch Cushman, right? But I digress. Long story, but you have to be able to act if you're going to be a spy, because that's kind of the job, right? Sorrell took up Harrison's offer to attend the play, but again, it blows up in Harrison's face.
Yes, it does.
It seems old Harrison was a little bit nervous about his stage debut, and he found himself a bottle of Johnny Barleycorn, Mary. And he called him, and it turned into a call me maybe situation, to say the least. So he takes the stage basically hammer drunk. His drunkenness was very...
Was he full Hasselhoff?
He was a full Hasselhoff situation, right? So it was obvious to everybody that he was drunk. Sorrell is sitting in the crowd. He's mortified. So Sorrell is going to rat him out to James Longstreet for being drunk. James Longstreet is going to, in turn, refer Harrison to go meet with Secretary of War James Seddon. Since you're in Richmond and you're kind of a moron, you're going to go see the big boss with this one.
Is this where it was like, cease using Harrison's service and the spy is quote unquote paid off?
Pretty much. Seddon was...
So he's fired?
Seddon let his opinion be known clearly to Harrison about the dangers of a spy being drunk. And that was pretty much the end of that, okay? So Harrison is going to leave Richmond. He's going to go to Washington, D.C. again. But not to be a spy. He's going to go get married in D.C. He and Laura Broders got themselves married in September of 1863. And they took a honeymoon where? In New York City.
Yep.
Before Laura returned to her family plantation in Oak Grove, while Harrison still picked up odd jobs, mostly in Washington, New York City, and even Canada, which makes me think he was still spying.
Yeah.
Realistically.
If he's going up to Canada, and depending on where he's going in Canada, he likely would still have been spying, especially if he's going to Quebec.
Exactly. Why go up there? You can't buy liquor anymore now. What's the point of going up there anymore? But he did this, whatever the job he did this until April of 1865 when the war ends. So after a short time in Mexico, both Harrison and Laura, they returned to Virginia, where in July of 1866 they had a child. It was their second child, a girl named Irene, who would become Mary and Ralph's mother, from we talked about earlier.
Yep.
But unfortunately, Mary's not a happy story here.
No, he leaves to go prospect gold in Montana in 1866, and he never sees his family again.
Yeah, he went off for a pack of smokes. He was
apparently he was a detective at some point.
He did a lot of stuff. He went out west, and and Harrison and Laura, basically their marriage went south. I assume Harrison was busy doing night work elsewhere, right?
Yep.
But who knows? But they separated, and Harrison is going to move to Montana after Laura refused to join him, and he decides he's going to try his luck as a gold prospector. Many jobs he tries. August 27th of 1866. Laura's going to receive a letter from Harrison from Helena, Montana, saying once I make enough money, he's going to return to Virginia to build a home for her and their family. It was the last time Laura ever heard from Harrison.
Yeah.
That was the last time. So jump ahead now to 1873. After not hearing from him for 7 years, Laura is going to assume Harrison's dead.
Yeah.
And she remarried a reverend named George W. Riston. Now, 20 years after that, Irene, this is Harrison and Laura's daughter, she got married herself to a guy named James Beatty, and they moved to Annandale, Virginia. So in November of 1900, guess what happens?
The dad comes back.
An elderly man arrives in town looking for directions to Irene's house. Ironically, the guy that she asked directions to was Irene's husband, James Beatty. What are the odds of that one? Obviously, the elderly visitor was, guess who?
The dad.
It was Harrison, who was very much alive, and he came to town hoping to see his daughter, but Beatty learned who he was and refused to let him anywhere near Irene.
Wow.
So Harrison never did see her, but what does he do? He ends up writing her a couple of letters. These are the same letters that Irene's daughter, Mary and Ralph, showed David Gaddy 80 years later. The same letters. And the very ones that would be used to identify him as the true Harrison later. The final letter he sent Irene in 1901, it was sent from Cincinnati, Ohio, where Henry had been living in and out of boarding houses since 1893.
Wow.
Lived in Ohio, tough time, right? Harrison appeared in Cincinnati's directory until 1911, when he disappeared, and most people again assumed that he had died and was lost to time. The trail seemed to end, but again, not so much.
No.
1920, Henry Thomas Harrison appeared in a Kentucky census entry that was just discovered in 2002 that showed him living in Covington, Kentucky, which is just across the river from Cincinnati. If you know the area, it's the home of Maine Strauss. You got the whiskey bars, right? Harrison moved to Kentucky in 1912 because why? Kentucky was giving away pensions to Confederate war veterans, and he qualified. So Covington, Kentucky is where Henry Harrison would spend the rest of his days. In 1920, at age 88, Mary, what does he do?
He gets married.
He gets married to Lucretia Allison, a local woman 25 years younger. It just goes to show, Mary, there might be snow on the roof, but there's still fire in the chimney. Okay, there you go, right? Good for you. Good for you, Harry. Good for you. But the records show that Henry Harrison did die on Sunday, October 28th, 1923, after he suffered a massive stroke the previous Friday on the 26th.
And he was 91 years old when he passed away.
Leaving a war widow, Lucretia, who was now eligible to receive a widow's pension. Harrison's buried at Highland Cemetery at Fort Mitchell in Kenton County, Kentucky. And he remained in an unmarked grave there for 79 years. Okay, so jump ahead here a little bit. 2002, Barry Becker. Remember him? Harrison's grandson who helped James O. Hull fill in the gaps to discover Harrison's identity and history. He travels to Kentucky to buy Henry a gravestone. And Henry Harrison is no longer lost to history. So he's got a gravestone now.
That's awesome.
So Harrison's story is fascinating to me because it's how close he really came to vanishing from history altogether. And if not really for 3 amateur historians and a chance meeting with his granddaughter, we would never know his true story, ever. Now, history shows Henry Thomas Harrison is not an actor from Mississippi, but a soldier from Mississippi who has just as much of any of his peers fought for the Confederacy. So from a member of Company I of the 12th Mississippi to a scout who provided the Confederacy, arguably with the greatest covert intel of the war, this is who he was. Harrison is why we study history. Because it just goes to show you just don't give up. You start digging these rabbit holes, and if you hit a wall, you keep going. Because if you do, sometimes you might get lucky and might find something that assume was lost forever. And that's Harrison's story.
Yep. Are you saying Buster could be real potentially if you keep digging?
You might keep looking. There might be a Buster, but for real though, I just need that. I mean, Longstreet obviously respected Harrison, and he just had a couple of throwaway lines in his Century Magazine article, as well as his memoirs. And someone picked up the ball. First was Bakeless, and it kind of spurred a little bit. Michael Shara was fascinated by that story, wrote it, assume that, he was the actor. History came out later, by the time James O. Hall picked it up. And now Harrison's evolved. Who knows what his personality is, if he was a goofy, fun-loving dude or not. But there was something to Sorrell's story that Moxley Sorrell wrote, that he was kind of an extraordinary character. So he probably was. To pay $50 on a bet to walk on to a stage and act takes a certain level of stone. So it probably is more like the Cooper, Huckabee character.
I think so too, and I definitely agree with what you say. All kidding aside about Buster, that Harrison is the reason we study history, because we constantly have to be digging for their stories, even if we know the person exists. You constantly have to be researching them to see what else is out there about them, and it could change your opinion about them. It could shed light on something that we didn't know about them, and that's why it's so important to read as much as you can and keep researching, because you could discover a story similar to Henry Harrison.
Harrison's story was discovered by 3 amateur historians.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it great. People just like a lot of people who listen to this podcast, us, everybody else who just loves history for the love of the game. And you keep researching it, and these people found something, didn't let it go. And now we have a full 360 view of a really very fascinating character in the American Civil War. And there's a lot of spies out there who people know about. But there's a lot of other ones. Sarah Slater,
there's not even a picture of her.
The veiled woman who maybe someday there'll be information that'll come out, like Harrison will be able to tell a lot more about this.
Yeah.
So keep looking. So if you're out there and you're studying this stuff, keep looking. God knows we will as well. All right, Mary, what's coming up for us next? So
next up, we are going to be at Gettysburg on March the 22nd on Saturday. There is an all-day event there. We are going to be giving a presentation about the Battle of Bentonville, and there's going to be other speakers there as well that day. So come out and see us there at Gettysburg. And that episode that we are going to be, or the presentation we're going to be giving there, is going to be our next episode, which is going to be about the Battle of Bentonville. Yes, we have done the Battle of Bentonville before, but we're going to be revisiting it and talking about some different aspects of it that we didn't discuss the first time around in our episode about it. So we are going to be doing that. And then we have to sit down here at the Old Civil War Breakfast headquarters and talk about what other episodes we are going to have coming up. But if you are in the area on the 22nd, we're at 9 o'clock in the morning. Come on out. Spend the whole day. There's a lot of great speakers coming out. We're going to record this in front of a live studio audience. And so hopefully... At Gettysburg. At Gettysburg. So hopefully there's a big crowd. Yep. And hopefully people appreciate it. We'll record it. And then we'll drop the episode later for the folks who can't do it. So, all right. So I guess we can drop that here as we head off and go get ourselves some cigars, Mary. Yep. Oh, yep. There's lots going on. Any final words from you, Fincheru? Well, thank you for especially bringing it with this episode. This is kind of the one you discovered and researched quite a bit. So appreciate all that you did, because it's a very fascinating story. And I'm glad that we got to tell the story of Henry Harrison tonight for everybody. Well, I mean, these people, they need to be, we keep them alive by talking about them and studying them. Otherwise, they're lost. Yep. And so hopefully we do him a little bit of service. So everybody, we appreciate you listening. Everybody have a great weekend. The weather is warming up, Mary. It is definitely sitting outside weather mercifully and finally here in Pennsylvania. Hopefully the sun will find you soon as well. Okay, so off we go. Have a great weekend. We will talk to you all soon on The Other Side. See y'all later. Peace out. Bye.